Hello and welcome to this week's What Were They Thinking? Amongst this week's news items we have the surprising evidence that taking advantage of people, especially regarding COVID, is not constrained by religion. A evaluation of the effect of ivermectin on COVID-19, but specifically looking at whether or not giving a high enough dose over 6 days is beneficial in a randomized clinical trial. An update on the efficacy of the monkeypox vaccine and genetically engineering chicken embryos for sex selection. The major milestones achieved when it comes to fusion reactions, and fireballs racing across Canada. The timestamps for these and other news items can be found in the description box below. Let's start with an article from the BBC, and it's about a purported bishop who basically misled his congregation into believing that they would die from COVID-19 if they did not buy an overpriced protection kit that did nothing. And we say it did nothing as they've been found guilty of fraud. The case does hinge largely on secret phone recordings and testimony from BBC investigators. They recorded meeting with him to find out just what it was supposed to do and how it was being sold. Given this is the BBC, it's rather amazing that the journalist at the centre of this described their purpose in all of it as, "My first priority is to get the story right for the public. We are thorough and diligent, particularly with anything involving secret recording." Not something the BBC is particularly famous for, but sure. Maybe the newest raft of intakes are actually able to do their job properly. The BBC investigator spent quite a bit of time in their testimony talking about how things came about and what exactly it was that the church was selling, and as it is described, selling very expensive bottles of oil that had first been sold as plague protection kits. The product was supposedly able to protect them and remove the need for things like social distancing. That's not how viruses work, and it's why religion should have no involvement in public health or, importantly, virology. This is why, in the same article, it's pointed out that not only had the local council, but also the Charity Commission told them not to sell this, and particularly as a cure for COVID-19. Understand, strictly speaking, we still don't have a cure for COVID-19. We have treatments which will alleviate symptoms, and we have vaccines that should minimize, if not prevent, infection. But there's no actual cure, as that's what your immune system is responsible for, and what vaccines bolster. Oil in a bottle is not going to do the same job, and never will. This is where the allegations of fraud come into play. It's impossible to cure someone of COVID-19 using an oil, yet representatives of the church repeatedly and extensively made claims of its medicinal properties. Further, that they were looking to try and turn it into a commercial operation, where they would sell bulk quantities and thereby lower the price from approximately £90 down to near £60. In court, under oath, the preacher, who is the one at the centre of the controversy, stated what the oil in the bottle was made from: cedarwood, hyssop oil, and olive oil. While it is true that something in a test tube can treat something else in the same test tube, this is also true of bullets, as demonstrated with the comic at hand. What you need is clinical trials, and these have not been done, and so medical claims cannot be made. The truly frustrating part of this is that while no, at this time when the oil was being sold, there was no vaccine available, once a vaccine did become available, it was effectively free. This means there was no profit in terms of the government making money out of this, whereas this bishop, who was committing fraud and scamming individuals out, was making a profit, and a not insignificant profit at that. Next is research in a similar vein that is related to COVID-19, but specifically a well-structured and well-designed clinical trial. One of the ongoing issues with much of the evidence used to support the use of ivermectin for COVID-19 have been either scandalous studies or very poorly designed studies. This is substantially better than any of those, and it used approximately 600 micrograms per kilogram of ivermectin. It was provided for 6 days, and it was compared to a placebo group. By itself, this is relatively simple and comparable to some other studies. The difference between this study and just about all of the others is the size. It involved more than 1,200 participants. They were all more than 30, and they all had more than 2 symptoms. They also were at a point where the infection should have been most serious. The findings of this should come as no surprise based on the other decently conducted studies. That is, it really isn't beneficial. It does nothing that a placebo doesn't do. And if that's the case, why give someone a medication with side effects and unwanted effects that could harm them when you could just give them a sugar pill and tell them to go on their happy way? Hopefully, with this study, it'll be the final nail in the coffin for ivermectin as a purported treatment for COVID-19, and people will come to their senses, but that's unlikely. Going from unproven medication to proven medication, we have the Jynneos monkeypox vaccine, and data from the CDC. The CDC has been following the rollout of this and largely facilitating it in order to curb the spread of monkeypox. Similar to the ivermectin study, it is reasonably well established in the way it was set up. It involved eligible males between the ages of 18 and 49 years of age. They were given 2 doses of the vaccine, and it was then followed to see what would happen. The short version of this is that amongst those who were fully vaccinated, that is, both doses, there was a single infection. Amongst those who were unvaccinated and involved in the study, there were 10 infections. Unfortunately, the numbers in the study aren't particularly well laid out, but we can summarize it this way. There were 9,544 cases amongst men between 18 and 49 years of age. 8,320, or just over 87%, were in unvaccinated individuals. 1,224, or just under 13%, were in vaccinated individuals. There was also a fraction, 17.8%, with an unknown vaccination date, so this may either have been very close or very far away, or at the perfect time before illness occurred, but without that knowledge it's rather hard to state the effectiveness. Less than 0.5% of all of the cases were amongst those individuals who had received their second dose of the vaccine more than 14 days beforehand. And that sounds about right. 14 days is normally enough time for the immune system to have developed the necessary responses and be prepared to deal with the virus should they encounter it. This then takes us back to the original statistics, 1 illness amongst those who are fully vaccinated and 10 amongst the unvaccinated individuals. That number is a standardized number. That is to say, if you're looking at the number of people who are vaccinated and the number of people who are unvaccinated, there is basically a 1 to 10 ratio, which shows you very clearly that being vaccinated is good, and if you are among the high-risk groups likely to be infected by monkeypox, being vaccinated will be extremely beneficial. Going from medical news to what you could call agricultural news, but specifically news on breeding chickens. Chickens are arguably amongst the most common livestock grown throughout the world for both their meat and eggs. There is one downside to them. That is, chickens, at least initially, are laid in an egg and there's no way to identify what sex they are until they hatch. There are videos of people very efficiently identifying which is a male and which is a female, and Japan was one of the first countries to specialize in this, where someone could quickly identify the sex of a hatched chick in barely a second. But that is a barrier. It means that if you have the standard distribution of 50 males and 50 females in every 100, the chicken industry has a huge problem. and this leads to billions of male chicks being killed and disposed of every year, as they have no benefit. This is where sex selection comes into play, and removes the massive problem having to do with culling of male chicks. The article from the Nest goes into detail on how this works, but the simplified version is that half of the required genes are in the male and half of them are in the female. If the parents reproduce and make a male offspring in the egg will not hatch. If they make a female offspring in the egg, the gene in question will not be functional. By having it split in half this way, they're able to create what is effectively a kill switch in the DNA of the animal, and this will ensure that no males will be fertilized and grow. That means there is no need to cull animals. The research comes out of Israel, and Israel does have a very good research area when it comes to various things. Some of it has to do with military technology, where they focus more on the protection of the servicemen and women, but in this instance, it's looking at how to more efficiently use what limited land is available in Israel. The challenge, at least internationally, is going to be getting this approved. Not because of the technique used itself, after all, the methods and mechanisms are fairly standard for genetic modification, but because it is a genetically modified animal. Will it be approved in various countries, as other GMOs have been, but only in a limited capacity? Or will they allow it throughout, and then you have the question of market acceptance? The challenge with this is that, for the most part, there isn't any actual genetic modification in the chick that survives, only those that are removed before they really succeed. And so we're going to have to look at how regulators approach this and the challenges that it will face. Next is a more interesting study in terms of its relevance to day-to-day life, and specifically on how sun exposure can shift your sleeping pattern. The research fundamentally looked at what happens during the 4 seasons of the year, and how much sun exposure you have throughout it, leading to the effect it has on the amount of sleep you have. Their findings were that throughout the year, the amount of sleep doesn't really vary, but when you go to sleep and then when you wake up, does. If you receive less sunlight, you tend to wake up later, but also go to sleep later. This is going to occur mostly throughout winter, where during winter, the sun sets that much earlier and rises that much later. Their finding was that if you had an average time of going to sleep, in winter, this was somewhere around 35 minutes later than the average, and 27 minutes earlier than the average in summer. The researchers explain this by pointing out that it's likely influencing your internal circadian rhythms, and that this in turn is what alters your sleep pattern. The researchers quantified this, that every hour of light during the day is likely to take you to bed 30 minutes earlier, and every hour of light that's at night time is likely to push you back by about 15 minutes. Going from light to energy, although strictly speaking they are the same thing, we have the record-breaking fusion reaction. America claims to have managed to break the existing record for just how much energy can be made through a nuclear fusion reactor. This is, theoretically, a huge step forward and benefit in providing energy, especially as we look at the way places like Europe are at the moment, with a significant reliance on fossil fuels. By being able to provide nuclear energy, they should be able to mitigate much of this effect and more effectively bridge the step towards renewables. The reaction used 4 parts. First, you have hydrogen isotopes, deuterium, and tritium. You then also need a laser. When the laser fired 2 megajoules of energy into this and produced plasma, they were able to get 3 megajoules of plasma out of it. This is a 1.5-fold increase in the energy used by harnessing nuclear fusion. This is basically the same process that goes on in the sun. Mostly in the sun we have hydrogen and helium, but on Earth those are limited resources, at least in the case of helium. Understand that this is not just a case of having a laser and shooting it at the right chemicals. To start with, we are talking about a tiny volume of these elements, something less than a centimeter cubed. Second, it needed 192 of these high-power lasers. Third and finally, the temperature generated. It was more than 3 million degrees Celsius, or nearly 5.5 million degrees Fahrenheit in freedom units, containing and focusing the energy output of what is effectively the equivalent of our own sun is no small feat, and this means that it is a very tiny but very clear step towards being able to use fusion reactions to produce energy, and very importantly, clean energy. The next big hurdle for this is going to be sustaining the reaction. The results as they are now lasted less than 10 billionths of a second. Yeah. The average eye blink is a tenth of a second, and this is 10 billionths of a second, or basically 1 billionth of an eye blink. Our last news item for you this week is somewhat astronomical in nature, and it regards Canada and a fireball that exploded there. Asteroids, meteorites, and similar debris falling to Earth are not that uncommon, but in this case it's something spectacular and unique to see. This particular example is even more unique than most. It is a piece of space that has travelled a long way to find its way to our solar system and then managed to destroy itself getting to Canada. And unlike most Americans trying to find their way to Canada a few years ago, this one nearly made it. Not for lack of trying though. The exploding material tells us several things about the Oort clouds, which is where the object originated from. The first is that this particular example was made of rock. Normally you would expect things like frozen ammonia, methane and water to be the constituents of anything coming from the Oort cloud, and so now we need to look at what exactly that particular area of space might be full of. While it might seem romantic to see a falling star, the data that you can extrapolate from it are actually quite extensive, and it's something that astronomers and physicists use. One of the things you can understand is by tracking the meteor's path and how far and fast it travels. The next is the kind of events that follow, notably how far through the atmosphere did it travel. As you can imagine, ice will break up that much sooner than something more substantial, and so they could figure out that given the depth at which it travelled through the atmosphere, it clearly could not be ice, therefore it had to be something substantially more solid like a rock. You can also figure out its trajectory, and from this they're able to then figure out just where exactly it would have come from, and that's how we know it's from the Oort system, not from something like our own solar system. That's all the news we have for you this week. If you found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Please post any comments, questions, or suggestions you have below.